Okay, well, welcome everybody. It's nice to see you, so to speak. We're happy to have Natalie Williams with us again for a third time. So she needs no introduction, and I will turn it over to her right away to let her tell you about our great panel today and the speakers. So just a reminder to please put your questions in the Q&A as you think of them, and or just say you have a question and we will go through those together at the end. So thank you again. Natalie, thanks for your role today. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Maria. I think the key of why I need no introduction is because this session is not about me. So I'm going to be very quick and pass it off to our presenters. We're going to be talking about new methodologies in the study of migrations and settlements today. So we will start with Zach Almquist at the Department of Sociology. I'll introduce our next speaker when he's done, but I want you to know that we will be doing questions and answers after all three of them present. So Zach from Sociology, you're on.
Hello. All right. Hopefully everybody can see my slides now. Feedback, as always with Zooms, a little not what I wished for, but I'm excited to be here talking about modern methods for estimating population displacement, evacuation, and migration. All right, so I like to give everybody a roadmap, give a sense of where we're going. So basic motivation for studying population displacement, evacuation behavior. I've been working more in that area, but all these things should expand to general migration areas and issues. So think of it for your own sort of research problems. Today's focus is going to be on data sources for this sort of information. It's sort of a big data kind of flavor, and then bringing it all together. All right, so imagine you have a big disaster, flood, fire, hurricane, whatever. The core questions that immediately occur, of course, is what places are most affected and where are people going? So why do we care about this? It matters for distribution of relief supplies, setting up Wi-Fi or internet hotspots for people, estimating how much communication people can get to for emergencies, as well as NGOs and governmental collective action for donations and distributing supplies. And this is just a small set of things that we care about kind of post-disaster and why we care about where people are. So, short-term displacement can, of course, eventually end up being long-term migration. But here we're going to focus on data sources. I'm going to start with sort of classic interviews. Think geolocated data. Classic interviews, and then moving to sort of big data framework. So geolocated data, administrative data, social media, and then combining these with surveys. So taking big data and mangling them with classic methods. And I think this is a very promising area in the future. All right, so first, just a reminder, many of you, I suspect, are familiar with interviews. Basic pros. If we know a disaster is going to occur, we can do pre and post. They provide in-depth report on the individual's disaster experience. Some of them have even been used for like crude impacts of impact numbers, especially things like deaths. And then one of the most common strategies for immediate post-disaster survey, right? Because it can be, you just grab a researcher and assuming they've got like IRB approval, you can just kind of like shove them out there. And some people set up these IRBs sort of pre-ready. The cons are, of course, it can be very expensive. Not mentioned in here is it can be very dangerous. It can generate a bias sample, it's small n, and really you can't estimate things about the population and subpopulations that we might be interested in. So this leads us to sort of the first big data, computational data that people kind of have thought about for this sort of problem. Things like Adrian Dobra and many others have been working on gathering these big data sets of geolocated data and building algorithms and statistics to sort of estimate the problems discussed earlier. I mean, the great thing about the geolocated data is it can be used oftentimes almost instantaneously. It can be used to provide, a general mapping of where individuals are going. If you're lucky, it can combine with other data to get a sense of basic demographics, and you can aggregate it over a ton of different data sources that generate geolocated data: cell phones, IP address, mobile apps, GPS devices, etc. The con is oftentimes you don't have any demographic data. You almost never have economic data. The data can be very noisy. There can be lots of duplicates. It can be a very biased population. It can be a little unclear exactly what you're measuring, but it's, continuous, it's there, it provides a lot of cool information. So to give an example of where this I know is being used by a lot of NGOs is Facebook disaster maps. So I think this is like a nice one to look at. So it's the Facebook population. It can look at its population movement. It can also answer certain things about connectivity, power availability, and sort of long short-term displacement. So let's talk a little bit more about the limits of the population. I think this gives you a good sense of where geolocated data is both useful and not useful. So it's an opt-in setting in Facebook app, and only about 15% of the population opts in and uses this. So it's a very small set of a very large population. They only maintain the micro level data for about 2 months, which means that all you have for long-term research is the aggregated data maps. But this can still be very useful, of course, for NGOs and others who need to distribute information very fast. So it's a pretty neat data source. So one of the things with the geocoded data, right, is you need some sort of algorithm to make sense of it, to make it useful. And so the one that's used by disaster maps is pretty clever. They look at where you were sleeping 3 days before, in the period before the disaster, or at least 3 days, and then they look at post-disaster where you've been sleeping for at least 3 days. So this is going to limit some people, right? We're not going to be able to get people who are only displaced for 1 or 2 days, right? You have to be displaced for at least 3 days to meet this criterion. But it's going to have really low false positives, right? These people really did move, and they really did move to places, and we can get a sense of that volume. And so it's been used to estimate, where in the country people have gone and if people have left the country, to help NGOs and others sort of distribute resources. So one of the things that the Disaster Maps group does is it generates a map like this, and they've extended it to have some gender estimates. And so you can kind of see how the Facebook geolocated population moves over a country. And so let's take, for example, Cyclone Fanny, big disaster, number of fatalities, billions of damage, 1.2 million people displaced. And, the Facebook population largely did correlate with what the administration was finding. So the core cities of movement, as well as the return migration. So very cool data source, pretty fast. And so for NGOs and other groups that don't have the money to do this on their own, this provides a lot of cool resources for them. All right, so next I want to talk a little bit about administrative data. There's a lot of cool administrative data. For example, the IRS migration data, there's credit card data, there's the American Community Survey. The IRS data is very cool, but it is fairly large aggregates, county to county migration data, and only yearly, right? So you're not going to get this immediacy, but for migration patterns that are trickling out or displacements that are trickling out, it can be a good measure. So I want to talk about two sort of core cases that I think are pretty neat. One is Fussell et al.'s work on migration post-Hurricane Katrina, where they used the IRS data to estimate sort of the recovery and movement post-Hurricane Katrina for the following years. And then more recent work using the consumer panel data by Dewart et al., which looks at the return migration to Puerto Rico based on people's credit card usage. So, certainly going to have similar problems to online data. It's going to be wealthier people, but still a pretty cool source. All right, so next, social media. Try to do this fast in the last 2 minutes. Pre-post has more ability for retrospective, can provide rich data, text, location, pictures, can be combined with geocoded data like we've been talking about earlier, and can be combined with surveys. Problem, of course, by a sample. For example, you have to have a Twitter account. It's a certain convenience sample people have to tweet, typically limited to users with geotagging, and has typical online biases. So there's been some really cool work using geotag tweets from Twitter to estimate things post Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. And then there's been some neat stuff by Emilio using the Facebook marketing API to do something very similar to what Dewart et al. Did with the consumer panel data. So this is almost like administrative data to get estimates. Then we've got, classic surveys. They can be done pre-post, semi-structured, in-person, paper, phone, online. The big problem with classic surveys is, one, they can be extremely expensive to administer, and generating a sampling frame can be extremely hard, and then all the other standard survey problems. Some of this can be alleviated by combining surveys with social media administered surveys. So again, pre-post, but now we have a well-known sampling frame that can be a solid probability sampling frame. And so we can reweight things to get sort of better, less biased estimates. We're still going to have the issue that it's an internet-based population. So to give an example of bushfires in Australia that I've done some work on myself, with a team at Facebook, we administered a post-disaster survey about 2 months after, generating random sample of Facebook users who were in the disaster zone. We asked a whole huge battery of questions. Generally speaking, it represents Facebook very well. It represents the larger population okay based on census comparisons. You get more women, slightly younger people. You're especially underrepresenting people over 70. People tend to be a little more educated and a little more employed than the general population. Wrap it up. We estimated about 25% of the people were displaced. If you extrapolate this out, we do very well in estimating the total displacement compared to other methods. Cool extension, network scale-up methods can be used to estimate offline populations, cool future area, and summary. And I will stop and pass it on to the next person.
Thank you, Zach. Appreciate that. Next, we have Rowan Arar from LSJ. You're on, Rowan.
Thank you. Okay, let me share my screen. All right. So in my presentation, first of all, thank you, Zach. There's a lot I want to go back and investigate further, especially some of those citations that you included. So thank you for that. My presentation is more about how do we know what we know about refugees? So how do we work with the data that already exists to then ask questions that inform the academic work that we do. And I'll just start off the bat by saying that I'm a qualitative researcher, and I do mostly in-depth interviews and ethnographic work. So that too informs what I'll be presenting today. And this here is an image of a mural in Zatari refugee camp in Jordan. So most of my ethnographic work has been in Jordan. So I'd like to start off with these 3 images and make the point that knowledge production about refugees is an ongoing and contemporary project. And so these 3 images depict Alan Kurdi, the 2-year-old Syrian boy who was found face down on the Turkish shore. His image was shared millions of times and had huge effects around the world in terms of recognizing and acknowledging the global refugee crisis, and in terms of increasing some compassion for refugees, but also fueling restrictionist measures. And so the first image is Alan and Ghalib, his brother, both of whom died in the Mediterranean. And this is just a picture of them in Syria before their displacement. The second image is a cartoon that shows sea creatures crying over Alan's body. If you might remember the picture that went viral, it was essentially a photograph of Alan in this position. And it's supposed to depict the humanity and sympathy for Alan's passing. And then the final image comes from Charlie Hebdo, and it asks, who would Alan be when he grew up? And the answer is, they suggest that he would become like a groper or a sexual predator. So clearly this image is intended to promote restrictionist ideas about immigrants and asylum seekers and refugees. So 3 different images about the same person, but tell very different stories in the ways that they're framed. The point that I'd like to get at is that the social construction of a problem, the way that we frame a problem, also shapes the social construction of a solution. And so we need to think very critically about the facts that we establish that end up framing our academic work, and that's informed by what appears in the media, what appears in policy debates, and knowledge production by humanitarian agencies. And while academics aren't often, their primary goal isn't always to come up with solutions that can be implemented, our analysis is shaped by these frames. And so the question that is going to be guiding this conversation is, or the questions are, who's given a platform to speak about refugee experiences, and how are these stories curated? And I'd like to make the point today that there are epistemological considerations that academic researchers confront, especially with regard to political and humanitarian constructions of the refugee problem. Okay, so I'm going to start with the political, and it will merge into a discussion about the humanitarian. And of course, in 10 minutes, I can't address everything, but I'll point out some important things that I think we need to take into consideration. The first is in reference to what Cuellar calls the Grand Compromise, which shows that the vast majority of the world's refugees flee from countries in the global south, and then they are also hosted in the global south. This is not merely an accident of geography, but in fact, there is a global system of refugee management in which states in the global south host refugees, while states in the global north often finance refugee hosting abroad. And so what I'm trying to do here by bringing your attention to this grand compromise is to show the stakes of the global distribution of the world's refugees. And we see this in many different measures that states take. So here are images from a graphic novel that was produced by the Australian government to support Operation Sovereign Borders. This graphic novel tells the story without words, right? So just through pictures of what it would be like for asylum seekers to come to Australia. The message that it's trying to convey is that one may imagine that life will be nice in Australia, but in fact, it will not, and you should, these people are being discouraged from seeking asylum. Here we see other images that show refugees and asylum seekers, especially in the wake of the 2015 quote unquote refugee crisis, in which more than 1 million asylum seekers came to Europe. You see the cover of a Polish magazine that reads Islamic Rape of Europe. Here there is a notorious Hungarian camerawoman who kicks and trips refugees as they're fleeing across borders, and then refugees along the Balkans route. Right, so the point that I'm trying to make with these images is the stakes of the political construction when discussing refugee displacement and states' interests in controlling migration. Here's another image that shows an effort from Denmark to actually discourage potential asylum seekers from coming to Denmark. It is an ad that was placed in a Lebanese newspaper in Arabic that essentially said, don't come to Denmark if you keep in mind that we are actually reducing social assistance, right? So again, a lot of efforts that states are taking to control the movement of potential asylum seekers or refugees. On the other hand, you see the depiction of refugee hosting in the global south is different, is very different. So Zaatari refugee camp in Jordan is one of the most photographed refugee camps in the world. And here you see that life for refugees is depicted as something that, you know, there might be some hardships. It's clear that this is in the middle of the desert, but yet we have a lively kind of community. And what I want us to think through is, why is it that images that come from refugee hosting in the global south don't really depict the ways in which states work to control migration, even though it is the case that major refugee host states in the global south are invested in controlling the movement of refugees and migrants. More images from Zaatari camp that depict everyday life. Here we see kids at a school with SpongeBob SquarePants carpeting. You see kids playing soccer, riding bikes that were also donated by another state through an NGO, kids having access to healthcare. Again, portraying this story of an ordinary life that might be difficult, but people are doing okay. We also see several different celebrity visits that appear in Zaatari camp and other similar types of camps. We have Angelina Jolie, Ashley Judd, Ban Ki-moon, Kate Blanchett, and the whole, or at least what I tell students is, when you see a celebrity at a refugee camp, you know that there's an image that's going to be taken and shared. So somebody wants you to see this, right? So this should get us to think about why are we seeing this? I'd like to establish here that we can also see the intersection between the humanitarian and the political, because these refugee camps, they exist in states, and states that house refugees in these camps also have an interest, like I mentioned earlier, in controlling migration. So some refugee camps we will see depicted, we will hear stories about, like Zaatari, like what I just showed you, while other camps like Rukban and Hadalat, which are also in Jordan, you will not hear the same kinds of stories about, they will not be reported about in the same way. So here I want to encourage us to ask whose stories get told, and how do these stories reflect upon the host state and the international system of refugee management? Right, so here we see, again, a convergence between the political and the humanitarian in the ways that these major host states in the global south actually contribute through humanitarian efforts to the global distribution of the world's refugees, thinking back to the bloated map that I showed a moment ago. Continuing on with this point about developing a kind of literacy for reading the knowledge that is produced by humanitarian agencies, I now want to show two slides that come from the UNHCR's Global Trends Report. Now, the UNHCR's Global Trends Report is one that is like a go-to if you want to get an overview of what's happening in terms of refugee displacement. But if you don't come to it with a kind of insight about how to read it, you might actually get a different or skewed impression of the global distribution of the world's refugees if you were just to read the statistics or look at the numbers. So here in this quick overview, we see that there are 26 million refugees in the world who are recognized by the UN. 5.6 million are Palestinian. So the top refugee populations are Syrians at 6.6 million today, and Palestinians at 5.6 million. And if we combine them, we can see that's a huge portion of the 26 million recognized UN refugees. However, because Palestinians fall under a different UN agency, they're not taken into consideration in many of the calculations that are produced by the UNHCR. And so in this quick table, I wanted to point out that you can imagine how the numbers can tell a different story if we don't come to them with a kind of broader understanding beyond the ways in which refugee issues are framed. So what I want to point out with this table is if you look here, it looks like Europe actually hosts more refugees than any other region in the world. And that's for two reasons. One, Turkey is included in Europe in this calculation, and two, Palestinians are excluded. So the 5.6 million Palestinians are excluded from these counts. So my point in bringing these things together is to say that through political and humanitarian constructions of a refugee problem, there's a kind of methodological nationalism that is embedded in the measurement and analysis. And these are things that, especially when, let's say, we are new to the study of refugee displacement, should be taken into consideration, because they also create blinders and leave certain stories outside of the frame of analysis. And here, I just want to point out one example in which this is the case. And so from Alan Kurdi to Nobel Prize laureate Nadia Murad, who is Kurdish of the Yazidi minority, to award-winning author and journalist Behruz Buchani, each of these individuals is Kurdish, and yet the story of Kurdish statelessness has fallen largely outside of the scope of the study of or the discussion, right, of the global refugee crisis, if you want to call it that, because there is an emphasis on the states that from which these people are displaced. So we're looking at Syria, we're looking at Iraq, we're looking at Iran, but we are not really thinking about Kurdish statelessness within this story. And to further discuss the kinds of stories that are excluded here, I also wanted to include these images from my own field work. So here, the first thing that you need to know is that the key is a symbol of the right of return that has been used by Palestinian refugees who have been displaced, some of whom have been displaced for more than 70 years. And here we see examples in which Syrian displacement, this top image here is of a mural in Zaatari camp, so produced by Syrian refugees in Zaatari. And on the left, we see the key also used as an image to discuss or address Iraqi displacement and return. And the last point I want to make is that these insights come from doing ethnographic work and doing in-depth interviews, because it's identifying and discovering the dissonance between the kinds of knowledge productions that frame the debates that we're having versus what you see on the ground when you're there day in, day out, and when you're talking to people about their own experiences. Thank you so much for your attention. And those were the points I wanted to make today. That's it.
Thank you, Rowan. Clearly, we have some very different ways of counting people between Zach and Rowan, and very different ways of understanding who's counted and what that means when people are counted in different ways. Thank you. Peter, we have Peter Catron next up from the Department of Sociology.
Okay, so thank you for having me. For this particular talk, I'm going to discuss how we track people across US censuses, historical censuses in particular. I'm going to discuss sort of the issues that arise whenever we do match people across US censuses. And then depending on time, I'm going to discuss how we can bring other information about individuals once we have very basic information on how we can flesh out the crude measures that are already in the census. So there's always been this need to, or for studying international migration, to have longitudinal data sets, right? It's because we want to know what happens when people first arrive. We want to know what happens later on. We also want to know what happens to their children and their grandchildren. And so researchers have always wanted to sort of assess how well are immigrants doing and their children's doing after arrival. However, it's incredibly expensive to actually create longitudinal data sets to follow people across time, right? For one, we need time to actually go by in order to follow immigrants and their children. It's difficult to follow individuals who go back and forth from their home countries and their receiving countries and stuff like that. And so researchers generally use things like pseudo-cohort analyses or cross-sectional analyses that has a lot of biases, right? Because they include return migrants and those who are going to stay, among other things that cross-sectional data usually presents, right? But what we can do now with historical censuses is we can build these linked data sets that we need to answer various questions that we have about international migration. So the US Census has a 72-year rule. So after 72 years, the US Census Bureau will release all of its administrative records, including US censuses, that includes privileged information such as people's names, their income, and stuff like that. And so after 72 years, we get access to all of the full count censuses that makes linking possible. We also have recent computing resources that allow us to do this types of linking that's necessary for this. However, in a few slides, I'm going to tell you that you no longer need these computing resources to do this, right? And so with the release of US censuses and their subsequent digitizations by Ancestry.com and various research institutions, there's been an explosion of research that has started looking at linked historical data, right? So some people just do census to census matching, so matching 1910 to 1920 or something like that. Others are starting to connect European censuses to US censuses in order to track people from Europe that moved to the United States in the first half of the 20th century. But there's a lot of problems whenever we're trying to do this type of linking. Mainly, historical records don't have unique IDs in some way. There's no social security number, there's no personal identifying number that allows us to actually follow people over time. So instead, whenever we do historical record linking, we have to rely on people's names, their year of birth and their place of birth, and other information that should be consistent across different data sources. So originally, how people tried to do this was by linking by hand. Researchers would have research assistants typically use linking variables, name, age, place of birth, to match individuals through various websites, such as through familysearch.org. Even before these websites existed, they actually did them by hand by actually having census manuscripts of certain areas, and they'd literally just try and find these people. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort, it's very expensive to do it this way, and you can't actually match entire censuses by hand, right? It's just not feasible because there's 40 million people in one census, and then you have to find them in a later census that has even more people involved with it. And so it's not actually possible to link entire censuses by hand, right? And so recently, researchers have started using automated algorithms. We generate links with computers that is replicable, I can't say that word, across data sets, meaning that even though someone links someone if they were to link someone by hand, we don't always know if someone else would do that same link because people have same names, they have same ages, and stuff like that. And so using these automated algorithms, it's become very cheap to link entire censuses, link millions of people across different data sources over time, right? And so the primary way that people link people across US censuses is what's created by Ronnie Brudzinski, Leah Buston, and Catherine Erickson. And so what the algorithms generally do is they take the person's name, age, and the place or state of birth, right? So this information, in theory, is consistent over time across data sets. And so first what we do is we clean the names of the data sets. So whenever you get these data sets, there's non-alphabetical characters. We also account for misspellings of names, and we correct for nicknames, right? So Pete and Peter are going to be considered the same name. Then we're going to only look at the people who are unique by their first and last name, their birth year, and their place or state of birth. The reason for that is we can't actually distinguish if there are more than one Peter Catrons with my age, with my state of birth. Like, it would be impossible to distinguish between them using just these algorithms. However, there are people who are trying to get around this right now. Right, and then what we do is we look for all of the unique individuals in one data set, and then we try and find them in another data set to match them within different age bands and stuff like that, because people change their ages. There's a lot of age heaping, especially among immigrants during this, in the first half of the 20th century. And so using these algorithms that were initially developed by these economists, we can start tracking not only individuals across censuses, but we can start creating family lines in the sense that we can also find their children, and then we can match their children forward. You can even go to their grandchildren. The sky's the limit up to 1940 because of the 72-year rule, although we should be getting 1950 coming up pretty soon, which is very exciting. Right, and so there are a number of different variations in terms of the linking algorithms that people use, using those same basic rules, but trying to minimize false positives, because it is possible that you mismatch individuals, and in general, we don't want to do that. That's bad to mismatch individuals over time. And so there are a number of different adjustments that one can use in order to link people across different historical data sets. Now, originally this required a lot of coding and knowledge of how to type programs and stuff like that. However, within the past few months, the censuslinkingproject.org has been released. So if you're interested in matching people across US censuses, they've done it for you already. So IPAMS has the non-restricted data set available through their website, and then the Census Linking Project through the variables called HistID. You can actually match people across every single census you want using their codes from this. So their startup cost is no longer as great as it once was. You don't necessarily need to get into the weeds in terms of the algorithms if you don't want, because someone has already done this for you, right? But one problem whenever we're trying to assess or use censuses to track migrants or things like that is a lot of variables are incredibly crude. So for instance, not every single census, but most of the censuses ask immigrants whether or not they can speak English, right? And so this was just a yes or no variable that's assessed by an enumerator. And so what does that actually mean, that an immigrant can speak English or not, right? However, speaking English is obviously an important indicator of immigrant assimilation and stuff like that, right? Other issues with the census is that they don't give reasons for migration. So for instance, if we're interested in whether you're a refugee or not, right? We don't know that information from censuses because the census doesn't ask that question. So we're limited by that information. But the good news is, once we have your name, age, and place of birth, we can actually connect all other information that we have of you to the census, so we can get a full understanding, or we can build out entire people's lives across time. So just as an example of how we can do this, one project that I'm currently working on is interested in the English language acquisition of refugees in the historical United States. So this is joint with Ron Abernensky, Leah Buston, myself, Dylan Connor, and Rob Voigt. Natalie's giving me the I need to hurry up sign. What we're doing is we're using oral history. So the Ellis Island Foundation put together thousands of oral histories that we have. We have both audio and transcripts of all of these that we build other information. So if we're interested in, say, the difference between refugees and not refugees, well, we know whether they are or not because they actually tell us in the oral history, I came to the United States because I had no other choice or something like that, versus I was seeking opportunity in some way. So we know a lot about them before they come to the United States. We can also build out their linguistic ability. So we no longer need to rely on, yes, they can speak English, no, they can't, and who knows what that actually means. But we know that language involves a lot of things, such as whether you speak with an accent or not, or whether you're speaking with more linguistic complexity or syntactic complexity, right? There are a number of different things that we can do. And so using these oral histories, what we're doing is we're actually directly measuring those types of things, right? We're measuring the accent, we're measuring the syntactic complexity and the linguistic complexity, right? And so I'm going to sort of move forward, but we can actually, using the information that they actually tell us from their oral histories, right? We can take all of this information, we can both create new variables out of it, such as whether they're refugees or not, and then we can also create other types of variables as well, right? We can measure lexical complexity using linguistic measures, right? We can measure syntactic complexity using other linguistic measures. I don't have enough time. Normally with accents, we actually play audio of people so you could hear accents. But then we can connect them to their census records. So not only do we have all the information on the census, but we also have all the information that they tell us in terms of these oral histories as well. So we can assess whether or not people are achieving greater English proficiency, right? And so in the first half of the 20th century, it was. I'm almost done, Natalie. We can also sort of create these horse races. So censuses give us years of schooling, which we know has an important part in sort of economic incorporation. But we can also sort of look at English ability, not just yes or no, but how the different components of English ability to assess their economic integration, right? So we can see that having a thicker accent means that you're going to be earning less, and having a greater lexical complexity means that you're doing more. So that's the spiel of how we can connect people in across data sets as well as flesh out other variables that are sort of crude in the censuses over time. So thank you.
Wonderful, thank you, Peter. Clearly we have, between the three of you, very different takes on how to collect data and what the data means, all over the place in a good way, excuse me. So we're going to go to the discussion period now, and I'm going to start with our third out of three questions. That's a good question for all of you. Kieran Blakey, do you want to, Maria, can you let Kieran unmute Kieran?
Sure, thanks. So my broad question was just really to each of you, as someone that's kind of new to the field of demography and studying populations and population movement, is there one particular paper or resource that each of you would recommend someone new to the field engages with?
Rowan?
That's a great question. I'll tee up Rowan because I know she has an annual review of sociology paper that.
Thank you. Sure, Kieran, you can, David Fitzgerald and I have an annual review of sociology paper on the sociology of refugee migration that you can check out to look at how to theorize or think through how to theorize refugee displacement. But in terms of my talk, I was actually thinking of an assignment that I often give undergrads that I think is really fun, which is to take the UNHCR's Global Trends Report, and then you can compare it to a report that was produced by UC Berkeley's I think it's called Belonging and Othering Institute, but it's called Moving Targets. And it's a really fascinating comparison because the Berkeley report is more interested in kind of like historical disparities, especially tied to colonial pasts, and also thinking about climate displacement and other kinds of refugees, while the UNHCR report is obviously produced by a UN agency that has other kinds of restrictions and considerations in the knowledge that they produce. And I think making that comparison will really not only be fun and engaging, but will allow you to see the ways in which humanitarian knowledge production can differ from academic knowledge production, even about very similar kinds of like overarching information or data about displacement.
Thank you. Before we go into this, you be careful the questions you ask for Rawan. She might give you an assignment. Zach, do you have a particular paper you can suggest?
So I don't know if I have a single paper. There is no review of the kind of stuff I talked about that I know of that exists. Emilio has a good like collection of like 3 or 4 papers, all of which are excellent. I highly recommend. I really like the relatively new demography paper by Dennis Feehan and Curtis Cobb. That's a good, has a like a collection of some of the things that I've talked about. And then I'm writing a paper that's got an R&R, and if it ever gets published, I would also recommend, but it's not quite there yet. Those are like the core set of things. I recommend a couple other papers that I mentioned in my talk for like the administrative data. If you look up Jack DeWard or that sort of group, they've done a bunch of very cool things in the administrative work, post-disasters, the IRS data, the panel data. And then there's some very neat work on Twitter coming out of, sorry, I always forget this person's name and I feel really bad, but I did have it in the talk, so that makes up for it, right? Martin's group has like 3 or 4 papers with Twitter that are very cool and looking at this sort of like displacement stuff. So those are like a huge body of random things, but there is no overarching yet, unfortunately.
Thank you. Peter?
Yeah, so there's a lot of methodological papers on census linking because that we're all very concerned, are we actually doing what we say we're doing? If you go to that censuslinkingproject.org, they do have linked to their, in their website, a link to a methodological paper that goes through every single algorithm that has been created to link people and sort of assesses how well they do relative to different hand matches. And that's sort of the best place to start in terms of concerns that we have versus what we actually do. The good news is whenever you start running regressions, all the answers end up being the same, like you end up with the same point estimates or about the same point estimates. So that's always encouraging. But yeah, I mean, if you just go to that website, I think they have several papers that are linked.
All right, thank you. I'll start off the top of the questions here. Dr. Arar, can you revisit your point about pictures taken in refugee camps? How does methodological nationalism affect what is being portrayed in these photographs? Very interesting presentation, thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, anonymous attendee, for the question. I love this question because I'm actually writing another paper that's just about how refugee camps are portrayed and which refugee camps are portrayed. And so where do I start here? There are several different refugee camps in Jordan, some of which are for Syrians. Some refugee camps are run between the UN and the states, and those are often photographed, and those photographs appear in news articles in the New York Times. They're in different UN reports. They're the pictures that you see that make it look like that's what refugees' lives are like in Jordan or in other major host states like Turkey or Lebanon. Meanwhile, there are refugee camps that aren't pictured at all, like Rukban and Hadalat. You rarely see those, and you rarely see reports. And those camps are often not run in conjunction with the UN. And so in these ways, the state can represent refugee hosting in a particular way, and the international system in which states finance refugee hosting abroad can show that refugee hosting in the global south is working out really well. And they do that by showing a certain kind of state, let's say, a kind of narrative that supports an image of the host state, right? And in doing so, that excludes other aspects of what refugee hosting is like. And so I think that this thesis about methodological nationalism has to do with how we learn, how we measure where refugees are and where we imagine that they belong. And so in that way, I think the images that come from refugee camps, and especially in this other paper I mentioned about different kinds of refugee camps, the PR camps, what I'm calling PR refugee camps, help support a certain kind of narrative about the state that also supports the status quo in terms of the global distribution of the world's refugees. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. We're going to stick with one more question for Rawan from Amy Hagopian. Amy, do you want to speak yourself?
Yes, thank you. I love these talks. Thank you so much. I'm currently working on a project around tracking the both intended and maybe unintended effects of hotel housing among people without homes during the pandemic. It's been a strategy of the VA as well as other administrative bodies. And we are interested in tracking some of the people who were placed in these facilities during the pandemic over time. And I'm very curious if any of you had any potentially creative ideas about how we might do that. Or sort of in general, thinking about homeless populations and how to track them over time after certain sorts of interventions. These are not refugees, but they could be thought of as internally displaced people in the United States, victims of capitalism, whatever. Thanks.
I think I'm actually going to send this question to the one who's smiling, Zach.
So I certainly have a number of thoughts, and this is like an area that's very much in like my larger long-term research agenda. Most of the stuff that I've thought about and worked on has been focusing not on tracking, but just on counting, as well as like figuring out ways to get access to people's like social networks and to characterize and understand how that affects their ability to sort of get out of someone experiencing homelessness. I think if I was to run a project like what you were describing, I probably would very much leverage these social media based survey kind of formats. I don't know about the cases of people, but there are, assuming, depending on the population, some of which can fill out a survey and some can't, but of the population that could fill out a survey, you have, a handle, whether it be Twitter, Facebook, email, anything like that, where you could continually follow people. You could try to combine this in some intelligent way with like the HMIS, right? The Homeless Management Information System that a lot of the nonprofits work with. That adds a lot of complexity because they record all sorts of wildly sensitive data. And I think that feels like one of the biggest problems. One is tracking people could lead to problems, and that some of it's like really sensitive information, which is why I've like tried to stick to aggregate issues. But if you're trying to track individual people, I think leveraging online systems with cell phones and maybe even provided data for them would be like one of the most natural ways to go.
Thanks. Rowan or Peter, do you have any comments on that one? Okay.
Well,
Let's move on.
thank you for asking, but I feel like Zach's the expert here on that one.
Okay, we'll move on to Ann Bostrom. She writes, as I think we're all feeling, excellent talks all. Could you, oh, actually, Ann, speak for yourself.
It's just a follow-up question to an earlier question. Thank you. Wonderful talks, you guys. Could you, I don't know, you mentioned you're writing a review, Zach. I was wondering if you could write a review, if this is not it, of how migration and displacement research and disaster research, response research can inform one another methodologically.
Great.
Sorry, are you asking like, could I write a review of such a thing?
Or is that the review you're writing?
So there's a review aspect because I like one of my hats is as a methodologist, and so I'm very comparative in nature to like how well the thing I'm working on compares to other things, and so there is a review component that's probably much more intensive than you'd get in like an average like substantive paper for good or ill. So in that sense, yes, but not a like fully comprehensive one. Like there's very much room in the field for sort of taking all of the ideas and either doing like some sort of simulation or just some sort of reasonable comparative like set. Which would be great to do, but would take a bunch of time and a couple of dedicated RAs, I think.
Thanks, Zach.
Thank you. Any other questions? We have exactly 3 minutes. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. These are fantastic talks, very interesting to think about, mostly entirely different subjects, but I can see a lot of relations between all of them. So thank you to our presenters. They are all at UW and I assume reachable by email. And I understand that this recording is going to be posted online. Is that correct?
That's right. And
all right,
the time frame it will be there.
All right, and thank you to our audience as well. We will see you around next week.
And thanks to Natalie.
Yeah, thanks, Natalie.
Thanks, Natalie.
Thanks, Natalie.
Thanks, everybody.
That worked really well, everyone. Congrats. It was just perfect.
Yeah. That was super interesting.